Hey everybody, Spiceman here from Virtual Air Wing 11. Well, we finally have our Tomcat, and in this video we'll walk through the basics of what we need to know to get up and running in the back seat. We'll walk through the systems, aligning the inertial navigation system, and some basic navigating and radar usage. So let's hop in the back seat and get started. Before I get started, I'd just like to say that I was lucky enough to be brought on by Heatblur onto the testing team as a rear seat subject matter expert. If any you watch some of my previous videos, I was in the Navy from 84 to 95. I was in VF-41, 1986 to 1990. Went to VF-101, 1990 to 1993, and then back to VF-41, 1993 to 1995. I was in avionics tech and AT in the integrated weapons team, the IWT shop on the Tomcat. So I've got 9 years experience or so on the Tomcat. So Heatblur asked me to be on their testing team, and then that was back in January or so, and it's been a really fun ride. And also I'd like to mention Jabbers as well. I've been lucky enough to work with Jabbers with some of his work that he's done, and I would encourage you to go look at Jabbers videos. He does a fantastic job of boiling down all the right pertinent information in a short amount of time. So I would encourage everyone to go check out Jabbers videos on the F-14. He covers several of the topics that I'll be covering as well. You know me, my videos are 2.5 hours long. I like to dive deep and talk. But if you want good quality content in a short amount of time, I do encourage you to check out Jabbers videos. And after I produce this, I will try and put some time marks in the YouTube for the various topics I go through if you want to jump ahead. I know this is a long video. I'll try not to bore you too much, but we'll see how it goes. So all right, let's get started. All right, so here we are in the cockpit. So what I'll do is I'll start with a walkthrough of the cockpit, get you familiar with the various subsystems and control boxes and whatnot, and then we'll get into starting it up and getting to basic radar usage and whatnot. Just kind of painting with a broad brush to get you familiar with what you'll need to know to be competent in the back seat. And as my usual, I'll be putting my spin on things and kind of doing a little bit of a deeper dive along the way. So let's go ahead and get started with the left-hand console here. All right, so starting from the outboard on the left, data storage box to put your maps and whatnot. So the first real control box here is the KY58. So what it does is, encodes your voice, ciphers your voice. The actual full unit is down in the radio avionics bay over on the right-hand side. In a lot of airplanes like the Hornet, you'll notice the entire KY58 unit is in the cockpit, but the F-14 wasn't originally built for the KY58. So when they added it, they put the unit where all the wiring was, which is down in the radio avionics bay, and what you have in the cockpit is just sort of this sort of thin client, remote control head here. But basic operation is, when you're in plain or off, you're in plain text or plain speech, all right, the unit is off, and then you turn it to C, you're in ciphered speech. You key the mic, you will hear a beep to indicate your cipher is active, and then you can start talking. So it's pretty simple, plain or off, and then cipher. Delay mode is not modeled here, but what delay mode does is it puts a delay in between keying it and being able to talk, and in that delay what it's doing is it's putting a preamble frame in front of your transmission to denote that transmission as voice as opposed to data. The KY58 is capable of voice or data encoding, and putting it in delay lets the receiver know via this preamble frame that you're encoding voice. But that's what that's for. And then this switch over here is for whether you want to encode radio 1, front seat, radio 2, the back seat, or this is a relay function that's not active in the sim or in real life. The Tomcat never supported that relay function, but that's what that's for. Going forward, we have the beacon augmenter. The beacon augmenter is part of the ACLS system. It's a pretty simple system. It has off, standby, and on. What it does is it gives the Spin 42 radar on the boat a specific place to lock onto for the ACLS. You know, you're shooting ACLS, the airplane, I mean, the boat is going to land you, right? So it has to be locked onto a specific point on the airplane. It can't just lock onto some random part of the airplane, wherever it happens to be getting a return off of. With the beacon augmenter, the radar is locked onto a specific point, which is the ACLS antenna underneath the chin pod of the airplane. That's what the radar is seeing, and that's what the beacon augmenter does. It basically, instead of getting a reflection off the airplane, the beacon augmenter echoes the Spin 42's RF back to the Spin 42. So it's looking at that one specific point. So that's what that does. It's got a push to test light here that you can push and get a bit test, and the light will go green. It also lights up whenever the Spin 42 is scanning your aircraft, painting your aircraft. So you'll see it blinking as the Spin 42 is sweeping you, and when it's locked on, it'll be lit solid. Over here are some different reply modes the radar beacon is capable of. Those won't be modeled, but that's what this is over here, single or double replies and whatnot. So that's what that is. Going forward, here we have the TACAN. It's your run-of-the-mill TACAN. Over here you tune it. It's got this outside drum here that tunes the tens digits. This inside here tunes the ones digits. Receive, transmit, receive, air-to-air, beacon, pretty much standard TACAN stuff. This is your choosing your X or your Y. This is an inverse normal mode that was never used sim or real life. It never supported that inverse or normal mode, so you can ignore that. Volume, bit tests. Run a bit test, the go and no-go light up, and then on the bearing distance heading indicator, which we'll look at a little bit, the TACAN needle pointed to 4 degrees, I believe it was, and then the DME showed 2 miles, and then the go light would illuminate as a good bit test. But that's how you bit tested the thing. But that's the TACAN. Outboard of the TACAN here, you have your liquid cooling. If you remember from my other video I made, certain portions of the AUG9 are liquid cooled, namely the transmitter, receiver, the master oscillator, the antenna, the transmitter's power supplies. They're all liquid cooled by this stuff called coolanol. It kind of had a mineral oil texture to it. It was clear, oily. And what this switch is for is to turn that coolant on. There's a AUG9 coolant reservoir and pump in the right side in the ECS bay, and there was a coolant loop. It ran through the heat exchanger. If you'll notice if you look at the top of the Tomcat, you see 2 heat exchanger outputs there. There's a heat exchanger, a primary and a secondary heat exchanger. I think the primary is for your ECS air. It takes bleed air from the engines and cools that down to 400-ish degrees, I believe it was, prior to going to the ECS turbine. The ECS turbine takes that and then cools it down to, air conditioning type levels. It does that by squeezing it and then releasing it, sort of like whenever you release compressed air, it gets cooler. If you've ever used a can of dust off to clean your keyboard, you know that it gets cold when you release compressed air, and that's kind of what that ECS turbine does. But that's one of the heat exchangers is for bleed air, and then the other heat exchanger is for some of your liquid coolant loops. The AUG9 liquid coolant loop goes through that heat exchanger. And so it's got two positions. It has AUG9 and then AUG9 AIM-54. The AIM-54, the Phoenix, is also liquid cooled. It uses a separate system. The reservoir and the pump for the Phoenix coolant is in the Station 6 or the right-hand Phoenix fairing. It comes with the Phoenix rails, basically. So that's what this switch does. One position is AUG9 AIM-54, the other is AUG9. There's a caution light that will light up if the coolant is low or if it reaches a certain temperature. There's a warning light that'll come on, but that's what this switch is for. Whenever you're operating the radar for more than a few minutes, you should have the liquid cooling turned on. So that's that. And then over here is the next one up is the ARC 159 UHF radio, basic UHF radio operation, nothing special here. This turns it on, main receiver, guard receiver. Over here, preset. This puts it in preset or manual mode. If you put it to read, you're reading the frequency that's in that preset. If you want to change it, just change it via the toggle switches here, and then rotate this to load, and that will load the new frequency into the preset. But that's the ARC 159. And then forward to this, let's go through this handle first. This is the eject command lever. So what this does is it determines what will happen when the RIO initiates an ejection. If the pilot initiates ejection, both seats will always go. Right? It makes no sense for the pilot to eject and leave the RIO. If the RIO is not dead already, he's going to be dead because there's no flight controls in the back seat. So the pilot initiates, they'll both always go. This determines what happens when the RIO initiates. If the lever is back into RIO, if the RIO initiates ejection, they'll both go, just as if the pilot initiated ejection. If it's forward into the pilot position, if the RIO initiates ejection, only the RIO will go and leave the pilot behind. So that's what this eject command lever does. And then here we have the SCP, or the sensor control panel. This has kind of three main sections to it. The bottom section is for the airborne video tape recorder, the AVTR, the HUD tapes, basic operation, off, standby, and on. This is the minute counter, counting down how many minutes you have left. The lights indicate whether you're recording or not, or whether you've reached the end of the tape. It's very much like a VHS tape recorder, this thing is. Over here was something that was never used in the real world, to my knowledge. It records what you want. It selects what you want to record. The HUD, the DDD, the TID, the TCS. It was never supported in the Tomcat. The Tomcat always just recorded the HUD. So you can kind of ignore that one. Now, this next section up here is for the television camera system, the TCS. It's got a slave switch. In TCS, the TCS is slave to the radar. It's got independent, where nothing's slave to anything, and then it's got radar that slaves the radar to the TCS. Next to that, we have a field of view. The TCS supported wide and narrow field of view. Wide was a 4x magnification, narrow was a 10x magnification. Next to that, we have acquisition mode. The TCS has a little acquisition window. You'll see it on the screen as 4 dots. It's looking for contrast in that window. If you have it set to auto, as soon as it gets some contrast in that acquisition window, it will lock onto it. If you have it set to manual, it won't do it automatically. You have to go to full action on the hand control unit to initiate a contrast lock. And again, there's got to be contrast in that acquisition window. The next one up here is auto search. What that does is, in addition to automatically locking on the contrast, it does a little search pattern to get contrast in that acquisition window. So that's what the auto search is for. These up here are trim pots. So if you wanted to kind of align or bore sight the TCS, what you would do is lock on to a radar contact, have the TCS slave to the radar, go to manual acquisition so it wouldn't automatically, lock onto anything, and then use these trim pots to center the TCS on the target that you had locked up. It was a way to kind of bore sight the TCS. So that's what these are for, these azimuth and elevation trim pots. The 99.9% use case for the TCS is to slave it to the radar and use it to visually ID what you've locked onto. The TCS has a pretty narrow gimbal range. It's like plus or minus 15 degrees azimuth, plus or minus 22 degrees elevation. You're not really going to be able to use the TCS like the MiGs have electro-optical, sensor or whatnot. The TCS was not really made for that. It's really made for visually IDing what you've got locked up with the AUG-9. If you're in a furball, right, and you're using one of your dogfights modes, the radar's locking up to the first thing it sees, and the pilot will normally have this TCS display on the VDI and be able to look down and see whether he's locked up to, a friend or an enemy. So that's really what you use the TCS for in the Tomcat. But those are your TCS controls, and then forward to that you have your radar antenna controls. You've got a selection of your scan. You've got the selection of your elevation bars. You've got a centering knob for your elevation bars. You have a centering knob for your azimuth scan. That's what those are for. You've got a stab in, stab out, which basically puts the antenna in stabilized mode or not. With stab in, the antenna is sweeping along the horizon regardless of aircraft attitude. With stab out, the antenna is sweeping along the aircraft's longitudinal axis. So that's what stab in and stab out is for. This is VSL, one of your dogfight modes. It's akin to, if used to the Hornet, the vertical acquisition in the Hornet. And it's actually funny that they've got this here. So this cover on the switch. So the VSL switch is actually the exact same switch as the stab in and out switch, and aircrews hated that switch because it was so small. Being in a dogfight, having to try and reach down here and find this little VSL switch in the middle of a dogfight. They've always asked the maintenance guys to put something on top of this switch to extend it to make it easier to find. They just kind of reach down and flick it. We would always use a piece of heat shrink put over top of this switch and heat shrink it just to make the switch, taller. So it's funny that they've actually captured that in a static model that they used here. But all right, so that's the outboard. Let's go to the inboard all the way in the back. This is your G valve. It's basically a weighted valve. It works on inertia. As you're pulling G's, this weighted valve opens up and air flows into the G suit. You can test it by pushing on it and force air to flow into the G suit. So that's what that is. That's your G valve. And then forward to this, you have your oxygen on. F-14A or B did not use O-bogs. You had two 10-liter oxygen bottles in the airplane, and this turned on oxygen flow. This is a vent airflow regulator. These seat cushions are actually vented. There's air pushed through them, and this regulates the seat vent airflow. So that's what that is. Up forward here is your ICS. Pretty simple operation. You got cold mic, you got hot mic. If you're in cold mic rather, the ICS foot switch is up here at your feet. So that's cold mic. Hot mic is hot mic. volume control. This is an amplifier selection. Each control box has two amplifiers, normal amplifier and a backup amplifier. Now it also has an emergency selection here. If you've lost both your backup and normal, emergency is using the backup amplifier in the other seat's ICS control box. That's what emergency is doing. So that's that. Let's see, let's go down here. So the next one up here is your, this control box has a couple different things. It's got the TACAN command. There's only one TACAN receiver transmitter in the airplane, but each seat has a control box. And so what the TACAN command does is it determines which control box, TACAN control box is active. That's what that's for. It's got a transmitter select switch where the RIO can choose whether he's keying the front seat radio, the back seat radio, or both radios. That's what this switch is for. Keying the radios is also one of your foot switches. This is where you can choose which antenna you're using for the rear seat radio, upper or lower. This is the volume for the pilot's radio and the RIO's headset. And then this isn't really used in the sim. It's the modulation mode for the KY-58. It's got BB and DP. If I think BB was baseband and DP was diphase, if I remember correctly. And it was basically BB was FM mode and DP was the AM mode. And auto basically put the KY in the modulation mode based on what frequency you had tuned in the radio, and that's the one you use all the time. So, but that's what that switch is for. You're not going to use it in the sim. Now forward of here is the computer address panel. This is your main interface into the OG9 for data entry and whatnot. It's got a rotating drum that has 6 data categories, and then your function push buttons here along the side, depending on what you want to do. We'll get into that more when we get into radar operation. Over here is a tile for tune disable. It disables the auto tune for the missiles. The missiles tune to the radar's frequency. If you look on an airplane, you see little antennas all over the place. Every missile station has a antenna forward of it and an antenna aft of it. And those antennas radiate a sample of the transmitter signal, and the missiles basically tune their receivers to that frequency. This disables that automatic tuning of the missiles. That's what that's used for. The missiles retune anytime you change the transmitter channel on the DDD. The missiles will retune. So that's what that is. Program restart is kind of the Control-Alt-Delete for the OG9. It basically resets the computer memory tapes. The OG9 actually uses computer memory that comes on cassette tapes, magnetic tape. And this basically resets that tape. Program restart. Program restart, along with pressing the computer sequence 2 bit button at the same time, actually forces a soft reboot of the OG9. But that's what that is. And then up here you have your keyboard for entering data, your lat and long, various target data or whatnot can be entered here through the computer address panel's keyboard. So that's the left-hand console. All right, next we'll go here to the left vertical console. This box here is called the control indicator, or the CI. It's for your, it does a couple things. We'll kind of walk through these sections. So this section here is for control of your station select, your jettison, and your air-to-ground weapons employment here. So we'll go through the jettison first. So the Tomcat has 4 jettison modes. 2 in the front seat and 2 in the back seat. The 2 in the front seat, well, the first one is emergency storage jet. If the pilot hits emergency storage jet in the front seat, everything goes, regardless of what the RIO might have selected here. And master arm does not have to be on for that mode. Master arm does not have to be on for any of the pilot's jettison modes. But emergency storage jet, everything goes except for sidewinders. You can't jettison sidewinders, but anything that's not a sidewinder goes. Um, the tanks go, and what it does is it ejects the tanks, stations 2 and 7, and the pylons, stations 1 and 8, all at the same time. 1, 2, 7, and 8 all go at once. And then it ripples off the belly stations. It ripples off the aft ones first. 4 and 5 go, and then 3 and 6 go, and it ripples them off at 100 milliseconds. So that's what emergency stores jet does. The next jettison mode in the front seat is ACM jet. If you raise the ACM guard in the front seat, it sets your gun rate to high, your sidewinder cool on, your missile prep on, but also underneath that guard is an ACM jet push button. If the pilot pushes that, it will jettison everything that is selected here on the CI. So by default, when you spawn in, I think 3, 4, 5, and 6 are selected. It's personal preference, but I usually start off with deselecting those and just selecting the tanks. So by default, if the pilot hits ACM jet, the external tanks are going to go. But that's what that is. Jettisons anything selected here. It does it in the same sequence as I mentioned for emergency storage jet. So those are the two modes in the front seat. The back seat has two modes, select jet and aux jet. Now for these two modes, master arm does need to be on in the front seat. Select jet is similar to ACM jet, and that select jet will jettison everything selected, all stations selected on the CI, and it ripples them off as I described before. If that fails, though, you have aux jet. You raise this little half guard here, and you can do an aux jet. What aux jet does, the modes I mentioned previously, the ordnance is blown off the airplane using the same mechanism that blows them off when you launch them or drop them. But if that fails, you have aux jet. What aux jet does, it's a gravity drop. It just releases the hooks that hold the weapons on, and they gravity fall. And because of that, when you aux jet, what you want to do is select one station at a time and then drop them. Because it's a gravity drop and they all kind of go at once, there's the risk of them knocking into each other, down there. So typically what you do is you select a station, aux jet, select a station, aux jet, that sort of thing. But that's aux jet. This jet options here, this option to drop the weapons or the racks, that was never implemented in the Tomcat. So that switch had no function in the sim or in real life, but that's what jet options was for. So those are your jettison modes. Now also, if you're in air-to-ground mode, in order to drop air-to-ground ordnance, you need to select the stations that are holding your air-to-ground ordnance just to provide power to those stations to drop those. So select your stations that hold air-to-ground ordnance for dropping bombs or whatnot. So that's that section of the CI. We're on the topic of air-to-ground. This is your air-to-ground ordnance selections here. It's kind of the similar things you select if you used the Hornet on the upfront controller. In the Hornet, you have your mechanical fusing, you have your delivery mode for your bombs, your air-to-ground gun ordnance selection. This is a weapon type selector to choose which type of bomb you're dropping. OG9 needs to know that to perform the correct ballistics calculations. This is your electrical fusing selection. Up here is your bombing mode. It's kind of akin to CCRP or CCIP. So if you're in computer target, that's your CCRP. The pilot chooses a target in the front seat, basically, and he has a bomb fall line with a diamond on it, and on the left wall there on the front seat is a target designator switch. He slews the diamond up and down that bomb fall line until it overlays what he wants to bomb, and then he pushes it forward to designate that target. The diamond becomes ground stabilized. And then there's some release cues on the HUD. The pilot holds down the pickle button as a consent switch, and when that release cue, it'll kind of march up the bomb fall line. When it gets to the velocity vector on the bomb fall line, the system will release the bombs, and that's computer target mode. Computer IP mode is similar in that it's the computer, releases the bombs, but what this allows you to do is bomb on a point that's an offset from a known point, the IP being the known point. So, you kind of use that when you don't know what you're going to be bombing ahead of time, or that it's it's something the pilot might not be able to pick out that easily, but it's a known distance and whatnot from a known point. And so that's kind of what computer IP is for. It uses the IP that you enter into the OG9 as one of your waypoints, but then what you do on the computer address panel is one of your function buttons is IP to target, and you enter in bearing, range, and altitude from the IP to what you want to bomb. And then the OG9 is it's a CCRP mode, but it's going to set the bombing point as that fixed offset that you entered from your IP. That's what computer IP is for. And then you have computer pilot, which is your CCIP. Basically, you have a continuously computed impact point, the pipper on the HUD. You basically put the pipper on the target, and you pickle to release the bomb. So that's akin to CCIP. Manual bombing is basically the pilot using your normal symbology has failed you for whatever reason, and computer or manual bombing is basically the pilot making his best educated guess on where the bombs are going to hit. And there's a bunch of charts that the RIO has in the pocket NATOPs that they carry that will tell you based on airspeed, altitude, and type of bomb where that bomb is going to land, and you kind of figure that out and take your best guess and drop the bomb without any cues on the HUD. Good luck. But that's what a manual bombing is for. Now, one where that is a useful mode to bomb in is when you're using the LANTIRN pod. So the LANTIRN targeting pod is a self-contained bomb delivery calculator, if you will. It works independently of the OG9, and when you designate a target with the LANTIRN pod, it gives you a steering cue and a release cue on the LANTIRN pod, and you steer off the LANTIRN, not off of anything the OG9 is giving you. You look at the LANTIRN display, you steer off of that, and when the LANTIRN gives you your release cue, you pickle the bomb. And so manual bombing mode is a perfectly legit mode for releasing the bomb based on what the LANTIRN is telling you, LANTIRN steering cues. This down here is data link bombing. To my knowledge, that was never a mode used in the Tomcat. It allows you to drop a bomb based on data link inputs. Never used to my knowledge, but that's what that is, data link bomb. All right, so down here at the bottom of the CI, it has some air-to-air launch selections here. One is the air-to-air launch button. That allows the RIO to launch missiles. The RIO can launch Sparrow or Phoenix missiles from the back seat. Basically, whenever you have a hot trigger in the front seat, you also have an air-to-air launch light lit up here in the back seat for the RIO to launch Sparrow or Phoenix. The RIO has some launch zone symbology on the TID that allows them to know when you're in, sort of the optimum launch parameters. So it's perfectly valid for the RIO to be the one launching the missiles in a BVR type environment, and that's what that's for. Below here you have missile speed gate. It's basically telling the missile what target aspect to expect on the target, nose, tail, nose, quarter, tail, quarter, or you can just leave it in wide, but that's what the missile speed gate is for. This switch is for a couple options, allows you to launch Sparrow in pulse Doppler mode as opposed to pulse mode, and it also allows you to launch a Phoenix active, launch a Phoenix with its transmitter turned on. It's not good for very far. It's 5 or 6 miles or so is kind of the most you're going to get out of that. But that's what that does. It allows you to launch the Phoenix in active mode as opposed to the AUG-9 initially steering it. And then over here is your next launch. So what this is, if you have multiple targets on the AUG-9 picks a launch order for you based on what it determines to be the priority of the threats. But you can override that if you hook a target on the TID that you want to launch on first. You can hook it, press the next launch button here, and that will put that hooked target at the top of the launch order, force it to the top, override the AUG-9's automatic launch order determination. So that's what that is, and that's just the control indicator. Oh, I didn't mention over here the bomb delivery options. If you want to drop more than one bomb, this is where you pick your quantity and your ripple interval here. It's in milliseconds on the Tomcat, so you pick your ripple interval here. Forgot to mention those two thumb wheels, but that's the CI. The CI and its power supply together make up a subsystem called the AUG-15. If you ever hear that term, AUG-15, it's basically referring to the CI and the power supply that supplies power to the rails. So that's that. Above that, basic flight instruments, don't need to kind of go through those, along with UHF frequency repeater shows you what the pilot has selected on the front seat radio. So that's this panel here. Underneath this locked panel here was this is the ground power system test panel. There were some things in here that allowed you to test various systems on the ground, supplied electrical power to some systems that weren't normally powered on the ground, bypassed some interlocks. That was under here. It was never used by the RIO or used in flight. And when you closed it, it forced the switches to their default position just by closing it. So that's what that is under there. All right, let's move on to the other side. All right, now let's walk through the right-hand console. First off here, we have the ECMD. That name is kind of a carryover from when before the ALR-67 came out with its separate indicator. This was the display for the ALR-45 and 50. Doesn't really use for that anymore, but the name carries over, the ECMD. Now it's primarily a repeater for the HSD in the front seat. So that's this guy. And then working back here, you've got the ALR-67. A couple controls on it. Power on is a button here to initiate tests that you can do after it warms up. This is offset and limit if you want to offset the symbols on the RWR display to kind of spread them out. Limits the number of symbols on the RWR display, kind of declutters it. I think it limits it to the top 5 threats, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, here's the volume control. This can filter the RWR display to certain types of targets over here. So that's what that is, the ALR-67. Behind it, you have the ALQ-126, your active countermeasures, DECM, deceptive electronic counter, or defensive electronic countermeasures. Basically, turn it on, you can run it through a test, and then it's got 2 modes, receive and repeat. So this is your ALQ-126. Back behind it, you have the ALE-39. This is your chaff and flare dispenser. Has jammers on here too. I don't believe the Tomcat ever supported jammers, at least not in my day. It certainly didn't. But so it's for chaff and flares. It's got off, manual, and then auto. You typically don't use auto because it is very judicious about dispensing, and you'll run out pretty quickly. Typically, you use it in manual. And you essentially have 2 switches here for chaff and flare, single and program. These switches are also up on the DDD handle as well. That's typically where you'd use it from. You know, typically when we're reaching down here and fumbling for these switches, you normally have your hand up there on the DDD handle and you're using the hat switches up there for your chaff and flares. But that's what these are. This is your number remaining indicators. Here you have salvo flares, kind of panic mode. It dumps all of your flares. This here determines what the pilot is releasing this here. So the pilot has a ECM dispense switch on the side of the stick up there. And if you have this back in pilot with that switch, he is dispensing flares. If you have it in normal, with his switch, he's dispensing chaff. That's what you use that for. And then back here is your dispenser control. So this is where you say how many you kind of want to dispense at a time. The terms used are a little bit different than you're used to if you're used to the Hornet. And the Tomcat, the LE-39 uses bursts and salvos. A salvo being a collection of bursts. So let's say I wanted to release 2 chaff here. I want to release them 0.2 seconds apart. That's my burst. And then I want to do that, 2 times. That's my salvo quantity. And each of those times I want to be 2 seconds apart. That's my salvo interval. So those are what those thumb wheels do. You have 2 thumb wheels here, the yellow ones for the flares. You tell it how many flares you want to release and how many seconds apart. And then the white thumb wheels are for the jammers. You're not going to use those. And then over here on the right-hand side of this is where you tell the system what is loaded. The LE-39 has 2 buckets. Each bucket has 2 sections to it. A section of 10 expendables and a section of 20 expendables. And this is, you tell it what is in each one of those sections, be it flare, chaff, or jammers. And then once you tell the system what's loaded, you put the quantities here in the window, and they count down from there. DCS will pull these numbers from the mission editor, but in the real world, you had to program your quantities in here. That's what those are for. Let me take a look back here. This switch back here is a kind of a relic from the ALR 45 and 50. This switch used to be on the ALR 45-50 control panel up here. What it does is it selects what you want displayed, on the ECMD, whether you want to display the ADF bug, the data block for the waypoint or whatnot you have selected, or both. That's kind of what that was. I don't think they're going to model this in DCS, but that's what that was for, whether you want to display the ADF bug and the data block on the ECMD or not. So don't need to worry about that one. Let me realign myself here. And let's talk about the outboard here. This is the DD. It's the first 3 control boxes here are your data link system. You've got a DDI here, the digital data indicator. These were discretes that could be sent from the data link host, the E2, various commands it could send you over the data link system that would light indicators here. I don't believe we're going to model that in DCS, but that was what that was for. Maybe someday when we actually have an E2 module in DCS, maybe this will work. But right now it doesn't. It's not going to do much. But that's what that was. DDI, digital data indicator. The next one down here is the main data link control box. Let me get realigned again. Sorry. All right. So this is your on-off switch frequency selection. This was to do a test or put it in anti-jam mode or normal mode. We're just going to use normal mode, but so this turned it on, and it actually had multiple positions. You turn it forward to on, you're in link 4A, link 4 alpha. You're receiving data link from the E2 or the boat. DCS has the Heatblur put a really cool dynamic knee board in the Tomcat. And on that knee board, it'll show you what your data link hosts are out there and available. So you'll look on there and you'll get you'll see either the boat. If you want to shoot an ACLS approach, you have to have the boat's frequency in here. If you want to talk to the E2, you put the E2's frequency in here. They're in the 300 megahertz range, so the first digit's always a 3 and it's painted on there. And then in this case, we've got 312.0 in here as the host that we're tuned to. So you get that off your knee board, put the frequency for your host, and in link 4A, you're getting data linked to the E2 or the boat, and it'll display targets to you. Data link targets to you, allow you to shoot a ACLS approach. Now, if you put it back into aux, you're in link 4 Charlie or fighter to fighter data link mode. And so you'd put just a pre-briefed frequency for your flight. You'd put that in here. Typically you use like 300.1, 300.2. And then you're in fighter to fighter data link, and you have an address here that you put a unique address for your particular airplane in here. Typically the -1 is 01, -2 is 02, that sort of thing. And then you can do fighter to fighter data link, and you can share targets among your flight. Other cool things you can do with it is slave if your INS is drifted, you can slave your INS, your coordinates to another airplane and update your INS. So the way you would do that is by using the computer address panel over here. All right, so in your computer address panel, you'll notice you have a data link category. So if your INS needs to be updated and you got a guy flying next to you, you can hook his data link symbol on the TID and press fighter to fighter nav update, and it will actually slave your INS to the other guy's INS over data link. So you can update your INS that way. Now, if he's not next to you, you can still hook him on the TID, but you can single target track him, and then click fighter to fighter nav update. And the AUG9 will use his position via the single target track, and by hooking him on the TID, you've said, hey, use this guy's position, and then the AUG9 will update your INS based on the single target track and your hooked data link target. So that's two ways you can use data link to update your INS in flight. All right, some other items on the data link control box. You've got your antenna selection here. You can put the data link on the upper or lower antenna. The data link shares an antenna with the front seat radio. So whatever antenna you've got the data link on, the front seat radio will be on the opposite antenna. Over here is a normal cancel reply switch. You can put the data link into receive only mode with normal cancel reply. I don't think we'll have to worry about that. One we will use though over here is the Kane's waypoint switch. It's for aligning the INS on the boat. The boat broadcasts the ship's INS data over data link. The ship has an IMU of its own, and it broadcasts its INS data over a discrete frequency. And the Kane's waypoint switch, it's not working here. It's electromagnetically held in the Kane's waypoint. I don't have power on here, but it's electromagnetically held in the Kane's waypoint, and it uses a frequency that's actually set by jumpers in this control box. You don't have to dial in anything. It just does it. And it takes a INS feed from the boat over the data link, and you use it to align the INS. So on the boat, you don't have to enter in lat and long and altitude of your own aircraft there for the INS alignment. It gets a feed from the data link, and that's what the Kane's waypoint is for. Once you go weight off wheels, it unlatches and goes back to tactical, and now you're using the tactical data link frequency that you have dialed in here. So that's what that's for. Back behind it, you have your interior lights control panel. You have sort of white floods and red floods and console and instrument light rheostats. Those are. And then going back here, you have your IFF. A lot of these functions aren't really modeled in DCS, so you're not going to have to worry about turning the IFF on and off and choosing codes too much. But this is your IFF. It has four main modes here: mode 1, 2, 3, and mode Charlie. Mode 1 is these two digits here, and back in my day, if I remember correctly, they used mode 1 to indicate what type of mission the airplane was on, like a mission number or something like that, I believe. But that was kind of mode 1. It's got two digits. Mode 2 is actually set down on the front of the receiver transmitter itself. It has a set of thumb wheels on the front of the RT down in the avionics bay. And what it did, it was a fixed code. The first digit was like for your air wing, and then the next three digits was your modex. And so that's what mode 2 was. Mode 3 is your civilian air traffic control. Air traffic controller tells you squawk, 7214 or whatever. You dial that into these thumb wheels here. And then mode Charlie is your altitude reporting. It reports pressure altitude to air traffic control so that your altitude shows up on their radar display. That's your mode Charlie. Air traffic control asks you to ident. This is your ident switch. It can also be tied to your mic as well. So you ident when you're keyed up. We're not going to use that in DCS. This is your mode 4. Turns on your encrypted IFF mode 4 used by the military. Up here is an alert if you have it in light and you receive but do not reply to a mode 4 interrogation, it'll light a warning light on the caution advisory panel. If you have it in audio, you'll get a beep in the RIO's headset if you don't reply to a mode 4 interrogation. That's kind of what that was for. After that here, you have your IFF antenna selector. You can force it to the lower antenna or put it in auto. This is indicator lights, test, DDI, bit test, switch here. And then over on the right, it's a ground cooling switch. If you have ground cooling air turned on, here you can select to divert that air to the AUG9 AM54 cooling or divert it to the cabin. That's what that switch was for. All right, I realign my headset here. Moving aft, this control box is a relic, I think, probably on the static model that was scanned for the Tomcat here. It looks like a very, very early F-14A control for the video tape recorder. But this is not going to be used, so you don't have to worry about this one. Back here is not going to be used either. This is basically a convenience outlet in the cockpit. We had test equipment and things that were powered off of aircraft power, 115 volts, 400 hertz, and had a cord that you would plug into here. It's basically like a convenience outlet. Don't worry about that either. So that takes care of the right-hand console. Up here, on the right instrument panel, you've got a clock. This is your ALR 67 indicator here, fuel quantity. This is a advisory panel, part of the caution advisory panels. This is your BDHI, bearing distance heading indicator. It has an outside compass card that's driven by AHRS, automatic heading reference system. AHRS is your compass system. It's also a backup altitude, attitude gyro. It backs up the INS. If your INS has failed, you can go into AHRS air mass mode for navigation. If you're in AHRS air mass, you're saying that the IMU is really no longer a viable source for attitude information, and you're now getting attitude information, and it's plotting your navigation using AHRS. If you believe that the IMU is still usable as a gyro, you can go to IMU air mass. But what the what the navigational computer in the airplane and the CADC is doing, or the CSDC rather, it's actually computing your position, no longer using the accelerometers from the INS, but it's using pitot-static type data to calculate your position. It's not going to be nearly as accurate as you would be getting with a good INS system, but that's what it's doing if you're in one of these AHRS air mass or IMU air mass modes. It's using an alternate attitude gyro for AHRS, and it's also calculating your position with aerodynamic data as opposed to the INS. But that compass card on the outside is driven by AHRS, and you've got two needles. A larger needle is for your TACAN, and the smaller needle is your ADF. And then in the middle, you have a DME indicator for your TACAN. It'll be on your HSD, ECMD as well, but you've also got it here for your TACAN. So that's the right instrument paddle. Next, what we'll do is we'll put power and air on and actually get some stuff going here. So, all right, so we've contacted the ground crew and we've got power and air on, and we'll go ahead and go through a startup in the back seat. First thing I'll do is I'll close the canopy. As you can hear, the canopy in the Tomcat is pneumatically operated. There's a 3,000 PSI nitrogen bottle in the nose wheel well. It's good for probably 10 or 15 canopy cycles, and then the troubleshooters will have to refill it with the nitrogen cart. I'll tell you, refilling canopy bottles is the bane of the troubleshooters' existence. Troubleshooters are the guys that work the flight deck and the line, servicing things, changing brakes. They're the final checkers on the catapult, that sort of thing. There's an emergency canopy bottle in case that one runs out or leaks or whatever. There's an emergency canopy bottle that's actually up on the top aft of the canopy, a little sight glass there for checking it on the pre-flight items, checking the emergency oxygen bottle. So anyway, that's the canopy. So now, the pilot is, starting the airplane up, and typically the RIO kicks into gear after the emergency generator checks are done, because you don't want, a lot of stuff going while those emergency generator checks is running, interrupting power to systems. But even before that, we can do some stuff. You can tune your TACAN channel over here. You can set your jettison switches if you don't like, where they're typically set by default. If you're going to go off dropping bombs, you can set your, your weapon type over here, and select these things on the CI. If you want to, over here, you can check your knee board and put in any data link frequencies in there. Checking my knee board here real quick. My E2 is on 314.7, so I'll put 314.7 in here for my data link. Chaff and flare program, if you want to do that. You can do all that sort of stuff as the pilot is getting stuff going and gets through the emergency generator checks. When he gets through emergency generator checks, he tells the RIO he's done, that far, and then it's time to turn the radar on. So we'll go ahead and turn the radar to standby, and I'll put the TCS in standby now as well, and we'll start turning other stuff on while that is coming up. Turn my radios on, my TACAN on. Come over here, I'll turn my ALR 67 on, turn my data link on, ALE 39, ALQ 126. I think that's about covers it for now. So now my radar has booted up. Now, what's not modeled yet in early access is really how the AUG9 actually turns on. So the first thing the AUG9 runs when it turns on is auto sequence 2. So while auto sequence 2 isn't modeled yet in early access through my super duper special effects here, I can show you what you will see when it is modeled. So when the AUG9 boots up and when the TID first becomes available, you'll have the bit box, the sequence 2 bit box there showing on the TID. The flashing number 2 in the upper left hand corner shows you that's running sequence 2, and then along the bottom there you get a list of the radar computer subsystems, especially areas of memory application subsystems that run on the computer, and the system will check each one of those sub-programs and put a check mark over each one as it's running, and as it completes. You'll get a check mark, you'll get a X if something fails, or you'll get a D if it's degraded. And then when it's done in the lower left of the auto sequence 2 window, you'll get either a D along with some DPs, or a check mark if everything passes. So what DPs are is basically places in the bit test where it's looking for pass or fail criteria, and if it fails, you get on the display in the bit box and extending beyond it. If there's too many, you get DPs, decision points, and they mean various things. And you look those DPs up in your troubleshooting manual. There was also a little bit book that we carried around. It was written by Northrop Grumman technical representatives. They would basically do a brain dump and put it all in this little pocket-sized book called a bit book that we carried around with us, and we'd look up what those DPs meant, and we would change whatever was appropriately pointed out by these DPs. In addition, we could examine memory locations. There was things you could enter called fly catchers into the system, and you could look up the results of those fly catchers. It was a series of 8 numbers, and it was a memory location, and depending on what those numbers were, it was what bits were set in various areas of memory, and you could look those up as well in your bit book and get more clues. So between the DPs and the fly catchers and your own experience, you would decide what needed to be changed if something was broken. But this is what it looks like when auto sequence 2 is running. The check marks are marching along, and the number 2 is flashing there, and then when it's done, ideally you'll wind up with all check marks. And then after it is done, it flashes up here for 10 to 15 seconds or so, this sequence 2 symbol there with a check mark. And if you select your INS alignment prior to this timing out, it will begin simultaneous align and test. It will begin the alignment, and it will start running OBC, which is what you do on every launch. You run OBC. Even if you're on an alert launch and you got to get off the deck in 5 minutes, the one thing you still do is you run OBC. So what will happen, what you'll see then, is this display come up. This is your alignment has begun. You'll do your coordinates if you have to, or if you're on the boat, you'll get them from the boat. And then it'll start running OBC. All these various acronyms you see here are aircraft systems being tested by OBC. There are multiple classes of OBC that can be run. There's a class run on the deck if certain interlocks are made. And when the pilot has OBC selected on the master test panel, you're running, I believe it's class 1A OBC. You got to have weight on wheels. They'll think the landing gear handle down is another interlock, but that's it'll run Class 1A OBC when on the ground during launch when the pilot has OBC selected, and it'll test each one of these subsystems, and as it's being tested, various things will be happening with the airplane, and the acronym will start flashing, and then when that subsystem's done being tested, the acronym will go steady and be bright. Some of these acronyms are electronic countermeasures, the IFF transponder, CIA is your AUG-15 at its test, running a bit test, BAG is the beacon augmenter, AFC is the automatic flight controls. So when that test is being run is when you'll see the stabs flicker and move in certain ways during the test. AIC is the air inlet control system. It'll cycle the inlet ramps down and back up during that test. APC is the approach power compensator. That's your auto throttles. CAD is the CADC. RAW there is your radar warning. RDA is your radar altimeter. TACAN, it'll run a TACAN bit. DDI, it'll run the bit on the digital data indicator. YIG is the YIG filter. It's part of the ALQ 126 system. GCS is the gun control system. DLS is data link. SAM is your ALR 50 system. We're back in the ALR 50 days. IFB is an interference blanker. It is part of the IFF, I believe. If the pilot does not have pilot's OBC selected on the master test panel, you get that pilot OBC discrete. And then at some point during the test, when it's testing the IFF interrogator, that challenge IFF will start flashing, and it wants you to press the IFF button on the DDD. So that's the simultaneous align and test display running OBC during the INS alignment. So those things are what you normally go through during the alignment, and they'll be modeled a little bit later in early access. For now, all we have to do now that it's booted up is to get the INS alignment going. So to do that, I'm going to flip to ground align, and then I'm going to go to my knee board, and I'm going to get the coordinates for home base, and I'm going to enter those in my computer address panel. So looking at my knee board now, my home base, I'm going to go clear, latitude north, 41559, enter. Let me realign a little bit so you can see it entering as I'm doing this. There we go. And now I'm going to go longitude east, 41526, enter. I'm going to get my altitude off my knee board, which is 59 feet. Enter. And I'm going to hit clear. And then there's my INS alignment going. So the INS alignment display, I got a standby light illuminate up here. Ready light will come on eventually. I've got my timer here, minutes and tenths. So my alignment is going now for 1.3 minutes. This is a T for temperature. When my IMU warms up, I think it's 140 degrees or so, my temperature discrete will go away there. And this is my alignment caret. It's marching across the screen. There's a couple tick marks. This tick mark here is for the initialization. Basically the IMU has leveled itself out when it gets to this tick mark, and then it'll march across and it'll get to this tick mark, which is a course align. And when it reaches that, there's my T's going away. When it reaches course align, the caret will become a diamond. And I could accept that alignment at that point, and by accepting it, I rotate the switch to INS if I want to accept the alignment at that point. That's a course align. It's the minimum alignment needed to launch a Phoenix missile, so you've at least got to go to that far. And then if I want to let it go to a final line, that's this very last tick mark here. And when it gets to there, it'll put a dot in the middle of the diamond, and that's a final line. So when I've got the alignment I want, I rotate the knob to INS, and then I'm off and running. So all you got to do now is wait for that alignment to run. If you want to, while that's running, the ALR 67 is warmed up. You can run the bit test on that. It's the ALR 67. I'm in here alone, so if a pilot was up there, you'd see him tune in his radio. This would come on when he turned the HSD on, but I'm here alone for now. I can do my standby attitude, gyro, any other housekeeping chores that I need to do at this point. I can do, but essentially you're waiting on the INS to align. All right, there you can see we've reached course align. Caret has become a diamond. It's taken about 5 minutes. Our standby light is going out. We have a ready light. And we could accept that alignment at this point, but I'm going to let it keep going to a final line. And you do want to do that if you have the time. Let it go to a final line, but we'll let it keep going. And while that's going, one of the things we can do is check out the TCS. This is actually what we used to do while we were waiting on the INS to line, is play with the TCS. So the TCS is controlled by the hand control unit. You'd put the hand control unit in IRTV control. And as you can see, you can scroll around the TCS. There's 4 dots that you see in the middle. That's your acquisition window. So if you get contrast in that acquisition window, you could lock onto it, or if you have auto acquisition, it will lock onto it. These 2 vertical lines here show whether you're in wide or narrow field of view. They're there when you're in wide field of view, and they disappear when you're in narrow field of view. The other 2 indications you have on here is the rack and the GAC. You have a radar angle crosshair and a gimbal angle crosshair. What you're seeing right there, the solid lines, is the gimbal angle crosshair. It's basically showing you where the TCS gimbal is in relation to its, gimbal limits. If we had a radar lock on here, there'd be a very similar symbol. It would just be dashed lines, and that would tell you where the radar is pointing, as opposed to where the TCS is pointing. You'd see both. You'd see the solid crosshairs as the TCS gimbal angle crosshairs, and then you would see the dashed crosshairs as the radar angle crosshairs. But that's essentially what the TCS looks like. So, all right, so we're done playing with that. Let's go back and see how our alignment is doing. There we have our final line. We've got the dot in the middle of the diamond. So now we can go ahead and accept that alignment by flipping to INS. We're back to our tactical display, and we have the IN indication there showing that we're in inertial navigation mode. So that is kind of getting things going on the ground.
Ground power is now on. Ground air supply is now connected.
All right, so now here we are on the boat, and I'll just demonstrate to you quickly the difference in getting the INS alignment on the boat. So I'll turn the AUG9 on, and I'll turn my data link on, and I'll wait for my AUG9 to boot up. So there's my AUG9 booted up. And what I'll do is I'll go to CBA align. And you see that flashing HS there. That's telling me that it's not receiving INS data, and that's HS means handset. It's telling me that right now I need to enter my lat and long manually. But what I'll do is I'll come down here and I'll flip my Kane's waypoint switch, You see it magnetically locks into Kane's waypoint. My flashing handset has gone away, and now it's begun its alignment, and I've got nothing to enter. Latitude and longitude show me zeros there until it's aligned, but so there you go. That's all there is to aligning it on the boat, is utilizing that data link and the Kane's waypoint switch to get it its data. So there you go. There's one other type of alignment that we can talk about, and it has to do with alert launches on the boat. It's called an automatic stored heading alignment. So there's three types of alerts Tomcat squadrons typically stood on the boat. There's alert 30, alert 15, and alert 5. An alert 30 is simply having an airplane on the deck that is up, and you keep it up. You don't do maintenance on it that's going to bring it down. So it's just kind of your ready jet on the flight deck. The crew is still, sleep in their beds or what have you. So there's nothing special aside from not bringing the jet down that you do on an alert 30. Alert 15, the crew is hanging out in the ready room, ready to go for an alert 15. It's an up jet that's on the deck, and the maintenance crew will do an alert turn and set the alert, it's called. They'll just do a maintenance turn, make sure everything is working. One of the guys from the IWT shop, from the avionics shop, will get in the back of the jet during the turn, and they'll do a fine alignment just to make sure everything is good. And then you shut it down, and the crew hangs out in the ready room. And that's an alert 15. We would usually set an alert 15 every night that we were doing like a war game or something like that. I'm sure that, during Desert Storm and whatnot, the guys that were in the box, I'm sure they set an alert 15, every night. But that's an alert 15. And then you have an alert 5. So for an alert 5, the aircrew goes up and they go through the startup just as if they were going to launch. RIO gets a fine alignment, and they taxi the jet to the CAT, and then they shut the jet down on the CAT, set the parking brake, shut the jet down, put the chains on it. You just do like an initial tie down. Initial tie down is 9 chains, 3 chains per strut. You pull the SINS cable out. You keep the SINS cable hooked up. You don't want to take a chance on an alert 5 of not receiving the data link, getting a data link SINS alignment. So you have the cable connected. You put power on it. You got power turned on. You have a tow tractor, a huffer, there with the hose connected, not turned on, but the hose connected. And then a crew kind of stands by and everybody hangs out. The air crew stays strapped in the cockpit. The minimum crew, ground crew, is the yellow shirt for the huffer. Not the yellow shirt, but the blue shirt for the huffer. The yellow shirt to get you on the CAT. The 2 guys in the white shirts, the final checkers, will be up there hanging out. The guy from the avionics shop, the flight deck troubleshooter from IWT, integrated weapons team, the avionics shop, will be on the alert 5 crew, and the plane captain and a couple ordnance guys will be on the alert 5 crew. And everybody just sort of hangs out, take a nap on top of the tow tractor, whatever you want to do, but you basically sort of just hang out, and that's how you set the alert 5. And when you get that fine alignment and set the parking brake and shut the plane down on the catapult, the aircraft stores that alignment. It's called automatic stored heading alignment, and you can't move the airplane, and you can't change the heading of the boat. The boat has got to stay on that same heading, which is why you don't typically stay in alert 5s for long periods of time. But in order for that automatic stored heading alignment to be valid, you can't move the boat. And if you do move the boat, then the RIO's got to turn the system back on in the back and redo a fine alignment. So what happens on the start heading alignment is when the system turns on, the nav computer in the CSDC looks to see if you had a previous final line and if the accelerometers in the IMU are still aligned to that same true heading that they were aligned on when you shut the system down. And so if those things are valid, the system will do an automatic stored heading alignment. You'll get an ASH acronym on the TID, and the alignment will go much faster. We'll go ahead and take a look at what an Alert 5 launch would look like from the RIO's perspective. Alright, so we're sitting here in our Alert 5 jet. DCS doesn't give you an option to have a cold start on a catapult, so we'll just have to pretend we're over there on Cat 3. But you're sitting there on Alert 5, you keep power on, you have the stuff turned on that you know power transients won't affect, and you're not worried about heat. Then you tack in, you don't really care about that, it takes care of itself. The radio, the crew's usually got turned on and listening to what's going on out there. But so you're on the Cat 5 or on the Alert 5, and then the announcement will come over the 5MC, which is the loudspeaker on the flight deck. And you hear something like, this is the TAO, now launched the Alert 5 fighter, initial vector 300. The TAO is the Tactical Action Officer. He's the guy that's the skipper's representative for tactical decisions. Works down in the CBIC down there. But so that will come over the 5MC, and everybody kind of springs into action. The guys will get the huffer fired up and get air on the jet. The canopy will come down.
Copy.
Guys will be, scrambling around, and then the pilot will start the jet. We'll probably go ahead and flick the displays on, not even wait till the plane is really started there. You got cooling air on. The displays aren't going to get hot. So he's starting the jet. He'll start the left engine as fast as he can get it going. He'll start the right engine as fast as he can get it going. He's going to skip all that preliminary stuff because remember, you did a full launch when you taxi up to the Cat and set the Alert 5. So he's skipping stuff like the lights test, the instrument test, that sort of stuff. He's skipping all that and just getting the engines going. And the second he's got that second engine going and the right generator flicks on, the RIO is going to start the AUG9. He's going to turn it on, not even wait till it boots up, flip the alignment to CBA. That'll get the IMU going before the AUG9 even boots up. And then the AUG9 will go ahead and boot up, and it will be, it'll fly right through sequence 2 and into the alignment. And if you remember from earlier before, it'll start simultaneous align and test. So very quickly you're into running OBC. And as I mentioned, that when the CSDC detects that you got to go to alignment stored and the boat hasn't moved, you'll get that automatic stored heading alignment. And as soon as the IMU gets itself initialized, the alignment will really start flying. The IMU's got to get spun up. The gyro's got to get spun up, and also the IMU sits in a gel bath. It sits in like this jelly type substance that's pretty viscous when it's cool. As it warms up, it gets less viscous, and the IMU gyro kind of sits in that gel. So all that is kind of warming up and spinning up to initialize itself. But when it does, you'll see that the alignment will really start flying once it gets past a certain point. So you're kind of eagerly waiting for that to get going, double checking you got everything turned on you need on. You can flip the 39 on, the 67 on, anything else you need to turn on, you get on. And you're just waiting for that alignment to kick into high gear. About a minute and 1.6, 1.7, it'll kick into high gear. There it goes. So naturally in the high gear, as clicking along, you'll very quickly get to a final line. OBC should be wrapping up. You got your final alignment. Now, it's time to start taxiing to the CAT. So you give the ground crew that signal to pull that SINS cable off. They pull the SINS cable. And what the RIO can do at this point is go to CAT. And CAT essentially ignores the parking brake. So that gives you a few extra seconds to let that alignment complete as you're taxiing up to the CAT. You get on the CAT, it's time to go. You flip it to INS. You've got your final line, and off you go. They crank the ship into the wind. The pilot will, as soon as they see that SINS cable come off, and the pilot will radio that they're ready to go up in the bridge. They crank the boat into the wind. It's really something to see. They're cranking that boat around while you're getting lined up on the CAT. They get the boat turned into the wind, and off you go. All right, so we're in the back seat. Let's start diving into the radar here. Go ahead and talk about the, freeze my headset down here, talk about the hand control unit for a minute. So the hand control unit is kind of one of your main pieces of hardware here. It's basically a mouse. It controls various cursors and sensors, and you do it through these 4 push tiles here. TID cursor controls a cursor that you can put on your TID. You go to half action, the cursor shows up. And you can use it for things like, you call it hooking. Like I'll hook waypoint 1 here. This is the symbol for waypoint 1. And it'll give me my range and my magnetic bearing to waypoint 1. I can put it in DDD cursor. And there's a, if I'm in pulse, there's a DDD cursor that will appear on my DDD, and I can use it for various things. One of the main things you can use it for is if you're in ground mapping or whatnot, you can go ahead and put a cursor, go to full action, put a cursor on your DDD, and let's say that I want to designate that as a surface target. So I can come to TAC data here, I can select surface target, and then I can go to nav, and I can go radar fix, and then fix enable, and it's gone ahead and put a surface target on my TID. It just so happens to be right near waypoint 1 there, but I can hook that and get my range and my bearing to what the object I created on my DDD there. I'll do a little section on ground mapping, and I'll show some really useful ways to do that. Radar puts a set of range gates or range rate gates, depending on what mode I'm in, on my DDD. So let's say I'm painting a target out there, and I want to lock it up. I can go to half action. It puts my antenna in a super search. It's a plus or minus 10 degree super search, and I can go to full action on my DDD, and if I got a good target up there, which that time maybe I didn't, let me go to pulse. Maybe this guy is notching me or something. Let me go to pulse and see if I can't get it locked. There I go. So now I've got a single target track on the contact from my DDD. So that's the radar cursor. I showed you the IRTB cursor. a little bit earlier. So unlock that radar contact there. Go to half action, it'll unlock it with the radar cursor selected. The other things on the hand control unit are there's a thumb wheel here for raising and lowering my antenna elevation. It's more of a fine control. The elevation center over here on the sensor control panel is kind of like a coarse adjustment. The vernier or the thumb wheel on the hand control unit is more of a fine adjustment, but that's what that is. Up here is a button for HCU offset. So if I want to move the location of my own ship symbol on my TID, I could just go ahead and hook a spot on my TID, hit HCU offset, and it will move my own ship on my TID. If I want to put it back where it was, I can just go to any other TID display mode and it'll put it back where it was. The other button is over here on the side. It's called MRL. It's a rapid lock-on mode. If I hit MRL, it basically, I'm using my hand control unit to steer my radar antenna. And if I can quickly find a target out there with the radar antenna and get it in those captain's bars, it'll lock it up. It's not a very easy mode to use. Talking to air crews, they never really use it, only because it's very hard to kind of correlate what you're seeing out the windscreen there with where your radar antenna is pointing. It's surprisingly hard. So it wasn't really a mode used that often by air crews, but that was the intent of manual rapid lock-on, to basically use your hand control unit to directly steer that radar antenna. So that's the hand control unit. Up north of it, we have the TID. It's got a couple different display modes. Ground stab basically puts your own aircraft in the center of your TID in a north-up orientation on your TID. If you're an aircraft stab or attack, you're in a track-up orientation. So that's what that does. The only difference between aircraft stab and attack is basically it puts some attack symbology. If you don't have a lock or a weapon selected, you get the horizon line here. If you have a target locked, you'll get typical attack symbology. You'll get a steering circle and a steering dot and whatnot. So that is the attack symbology mode. One other thing to notice, I'm getting a couple data link targets sent to me up here. There's one here and there's one here. I know they're data link because the symbol is underneath the target. If this was a AUG9 derived contact, I'll put it in range while search. Maybe it's picking them up. Yeah, so this is the AUG9 derived. So I can get rid of the data link symbol and you can see this is my staple, and AUG9 symbology. That's an unknown contact. If I turn on my data link symbology, the E2 is also sending me this contact, and he's telling me it's a friend, judged by that sort of smiley face symbol underneath it. So I could designate him as a friend myself if I wanted to. I could, I gotta be in track while scan to hook it. Can't hook it in range while search. I'll explain that in a little bit. But I can hook it in track while scan. And then I can come down here to my target data, and I can call him an unknown or a hostile or a friend, you know, myself. But right now, let me get rid of my data link symbology, hook it, and I can label him as a friend, you know, on my own, and that's my friend symbology there. So that's some symbology stuff, the data link symbology. This is my range. Each one of these dashes and spaces is 20 nautical miles. So that's what that is. If I hook a target, I'll get pertinent information for a target. I'll get range, altitude, magnetic course of that target, relative bearing to that target. It's telling me it's 4 degrees to the left. So that's information readout that you'll get when you have a target hooked with the radar. This is closure rate over here, This is telling me I'm in INS navigation mode. This is my antenna elevation over here. This is the maximum and minimum altitude of my antenna at my selected range. This over here is just a computer run number. Basically, if that number is cycling, you're in good shape. Your computers are functioning. And this is a very similar number. This is also a computer run number as well. You don't really make use of those much. Just be happy that they're there and changing once in a while. Down here are different selections for symbology. Altitude numeric removes the altitude numeric to the left of the symbol. It's basically the altitude in tens of thousands of feet on the left there. So this contact here is at 20,000 feet, well, between 15,000 feet and 25,000 feet. And it's in tens of thousands. This is gets rid of your elementary symbology, and you basically just have dots. Data link we looked at. Jam strobe. If a radar detects someone's jamming you, you'll get a strobe emanating from your own ship symbol in the direction of the jamming source. That's jam strobe. Non-attack essentially removes all of your symbology and just gets you down to your attack symbology. That's for that. Launch zone displays launch zone symbology if you have a weapon selected in the front seat and some other interlocks. I think master arms got to be on air-to-air mode. You'll get some launch zone symbology. I'll talk about that more later. And then the velocity vector places or removes the velocity vector emanating from the target. So a little bit on that. The length is akin to your closure. I can't remember. I think it's 1.5 inches long if it's 1,200 knots or something like that. You can look it up. But the length of it indicates the closure. And the angle of it indicates the relative difference between your course and the target's course. And in attack or aircraft stab, this symbol, let me just freeze my headset here. It's probably annoying. This, as I said, this is a relative heading. So if we turn to be on the same course or the reciprocal as this guy, this would be pointing straight down. This is telling me that I got, what, a 30 degree. He's on a course of 310 or 260, 50 degree. This is telling me there's a 50 degree difference between my course and this target's course. That's kind of what that means. Now, if I go to ground stabilized mode, it's showing me the target's true course. So you can see he's on a course of 310. That's kind of up and to the right. This is up and to the right. So that if I want to get a sort of a good picture of what how this guy is heading in relation to me, I can go to ground stab, and this will sort of tell me that. This gives me a relative indication. So there's a little bit on that. The nav mode we know about. This is my destination steering selector. If the pilot's in destination steering, I can choose which destination I want him to steer to. What are my waypoints, my fixed point, my IP, etc. These push tiles over here, this is track hold. If I am in track while scan and the radar loses a track file on one of these guys, maybe notches me, maybe he's below me, or what have you, there'll be an X that will appear through it. But it'll hold that track file on the screen for, I believe it's 14 seconds. If I have track hold selected, it'll hold that. It's just not lighting up right now. But if I have track hold selected, it'll hold that track for 2 full minutes, as opposed to just dropping it after 14 seconds. Over here is collision steering. I'll talk about the steering displays in air-to-air mode here in a little bit. It basically puts the steering cue on the pilot's HUD into collision steering mode if I select collision steering. I'll go through a little bit more of that in a minute. So that's a little bit of the TID. let's unfreeze here, and I'll come up here and I'll talk about radar modes a little bit. Let me freeze my headset. Let me actually freeze sim here. Well, let me get a little more of the DDD in there. All right, let me go ahead and freeze it, pause it. I want that target showing on the DDD when it's paused. All right, that's good enough. So let me talk about sort of the radar modes in general here for a little bit. All right, so we have two main modes of the radar, right? We have pulse and we have pulse Doppler. Let's walk through the different pulse Doppler modes. We'll go from farthest detection to kind of closest detection. So your farthest detection mode for pulse Doppler is PD search. It sees out the farthest. It sees out about 110 nautical miles or so. So it is your farthest detection range, but it doesn't provide you range information on your display. It's kind of just if you're just out there trying to find, a target somewhere, and you simply don't know where it is, and you're trying to just look out as far as you can. PD search is your mode there. If you're seeing a target, it will paint it on the DDD. The DDD is the DDD filter is that's the night filter for the DDD. It's what that little hover mouse thing is coming up there. If you click on, I'm paused, but if you click on it, the DDD filter will go on to the DDD, which is a night filter. But anyway, so you'll pick up a target out there. You won't see it on the TID. You'll only see it on the DDD. The DDD is raw radar video. This line represents a ringing Doppler filter in the Doppler filter banks of the radar, and so you'll just kind of get a blip up here. Along the far right here is a closure scale, and 200 knot increments, 2, 4, 6, 8, 1,000 knots of closure. But this target here, in pulse Doppler, it's in an azimuth versus range rate display. So this is the azimuth of the contact, right? So he's 5 degrees left or so, and this is the closure. He's at about 700 and some knots of closure. 500 and some knots of closure. So that's what you're seeing on the DDD display, and in PD search, that's all you're going to get. In the other modes, you'll get some symbology on the TID as well, some processed symbology after the computer subsystem analyzes the target. But in PD search, all you get is this sort of raw video. Once it gets into about 90 miles or so, you can start picking it up in range while search, which is your other sort of long-range pulse Doppler search mode. Range while search uses a technique called frequency modulated ranging, or FM ranging. It sends out a sort of a ramped waveform, a continuous ramped waveform, and that allows it to determine the range of the target by correlating what it gets back to the ramp that it's sending out. So a good analogy would be, if I yell into a canyon, right, and I yell, hello, 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 and I get back, hello, well, I have no way of knowing, of measuring the time it took for that hello to come back, because which one of those outbound hellos am I going to compare it to, right? So, but if I yell out and then into that canyon, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and I get back D, well, now I got something to compare it to, right, of what I sent outbound. So that's kind of how frequency modulated ranging works. And by that technique, it allows it to determine the range of a pulse Doppler contact. The DDD display will look very similar, but you'll also get that target on the TID. You have to interpolate its distance based on your dashes and spaces on the TID. You need to kind of interpret its bearing based on kind of left or right on the TID. It doesn't give you a full breadth of information that track while scan will that builds a track file, but range while search is a real time, does not build a track file, so it's just kind of real time information with each sweep that gets updated from scratch. But it will give you an altitude numeric. To the left of the symbol, it uses the antenna elevation in that range to determine the altitude within tens of thousands of feet. So it'll give you an altitude numeric to the left of it. So you can call out a contact, a range while search contact in range and bearing and altitude based on your interpretation of the TID. Now, when it gets a little bit closer, you can go into track while scan. And track while scan, you might get it out at 90 miles, but I usually don't. I usually wait till I get within 60 or 70 miles or so to get into track while scan just to make sure that it kind of hangs on to it. But it is the least detection range mode because you're sharing a lot of energy between being in a PRF that is good for scanning and a PRF that's good for tracking. So it is your lowest detection mode. But track while scan has the benefit of building a track file. So with a track file on the TID, as I showed you earlier, you can hook it and it gives you a plethora of information up here concerning that target. And you can track multiple targets. Track while scan is the mode that the Phoenix must launch in. So if you're not in track while scan mode, I think it needs to launch in track while scan auto. So if you're in like track while scan manual and you launch a Phoenix, it's automatically going to switch into track while scan auto. And what track while scan auto does is the computer automatically determines the best antenna pattern for that volume of airspace that it's seeing targets in, and we'll kind of move it. Track while scan manual gives you some more freedom in moving that antenna left and right and up and down. But you are still limited in the number of and your scan azimuth and your elevation bars because track while scan has got to paint that target every 2 seconds. And so in order to do that, it limits you to 40 degree 2-bar, 40 degree 2-bar or 20 degree 4-bar selections on the sensor control panel. And if you don't have it there, if you have it wider, like if you had it in range while search, 65 degree, whatever, you go to track while scan, it's going to override you there and put it in one of those 2 scan patterns because it's got to sweep a target every 2 seconds to keep that track file. So that's track while scan, and I think the other last one there is PD single target track. So that's your single target track mode for pulse Doppler. There's 2 ways you can put it in single target track mode. You can hook it on the TID and just hit PDSTT, and the radar will attempt to lock on to the target you've got hooked. Or you can put the hand control unit in that radar cursor like I showed you and use center the target in your range rate gates on the DDD and go to full action and lock it up that way. So that's your pulse Doppler modes. Some of the other, well, I'm going to go through the pulse modes and we'll go through some of this other stuff on the DDD. So pulse, you have pulse search and you have pulse single target track. Pulse search, just sends out a radar pulse and looks for a return. And the DDD in this case is in a range versus azimuth display. So the target will be, azimuth is the same as PD, but as far as your vertical axis here, it's in range, and you'll choose a range scale with this row of buttons here on the DDD, and the range you have selected will appear in this drum here. These buttons don't have any effect in pulse Doppler, and the range drum will be black in pulse Doppler, but in pulse you can select a range, and then you use these inner marks here for your range. So if you have 20 nautical mile range selected, each one of those would be 4 nautical miles, that kind of thing. So that's pulse. Now you'd use pulse in a couple different scenarios. One is the target is trying to notch you, right? So if you've got a guy in track while scan and he's notching you or what have you, you can anticipate that based on his velocity vector there and lock him up in pulse single target track, or just switch to a pulse search mode and keep them, visible to you. Pulse Doppler has a couple blind spots, if you will. One of them is ground clutter. So when the radar is looking down, you have a main lobe of RF energy coming out from that radar antenna. And in order to not get that back from the ground, the system switches in a main lobe clutter filter. And that creates a blind spot. That filter is invisible. And remember, we're thinking in range rate here. It's kind of weird to kind of get your mind around thinking range rate versus range. But the limits of that filter is your ground speed plus or minus 120 knots or something like that. So for example, if you're doing 500 knots and a target is below you against the ground, the radar is going to be invisible to it because that main lobe clutter filter is kicked in. It's going to be invisible to the radar if its closure is anywhere between 380 and 620 knots or something like that, right? So that's a little blind spot in range rate that the radar has. And then the other blind spot is if it's notching you. Now, that's what this switch here is, the main lobe clutter filter. You can try if some guy is below you and you want to try and pick him up. The main lobe clutter filter automatically kicks in if the radar elevation, I think, is less than +3 degrees, and it automatically kicks off if the radar elevation is +3 degrees. But you can force the main lobe clutter filter off even if you're looking down and try and get a guy, but it's going to be pretty difficult. So what you can do is if the guy kind of gets below you is just go to pulse. But again, pulse is also, if he tries to notch you rather, is go to pulse. But pulse is only going to be good, again, if you're looking up. If you're looking down, pulse is very susceptible to losing targets in the ground return. So your best bet is to always keep a target higher than you. And the AUG-9 is actually really immune to notching if a target is above you. Even if he tries to notch, the AUG-9 does a really good job of keeping track of a target that's above you. It'll lose them against the ground because that main lobe clutter filter kicks in. But you keep them higher than you, and the AUG-9 is really hard to shake loose. And if he does notch you, just quickly reach up there and get him in the pulse STT. And as long as he's above you, you're immune to notching there with pulse. So that's one of the main purposes or benefits of pulse. The other thing that pulse is really good at is finding targets on the water. And you can do some ground mapping, some rudimentary ground mapping. It's not a great ground mapping radar. It wasn't really built for that. But you can use pulse for some basic ground mapping. But one thing that pulse is really good at is finding ships on the water. I'll demonstrate that to you in a little bit. Ships on the water stick out like a sore thumb to pulse radar because the water is relatively flat, and so RF energy skips off the water like a stone on a lake, and it just keeps heading away from you. But a ship obviously doesn't. So ships stick out like a sore thumb to pulse radar. So if your mission is to go find an enemy fleet or something like that, pulse search is a great way to do that. And you can find them and designate them as a surface target like I kind of showed you earlier. So that's pulse. What else on here is worth going through? There's a lot of these controls here aren't really modeled in the sim. There's a jam jet threshold here that sets a threshold. The radar above a certain amount of energy coming back will declare that energy to be a jam source as opposed to a radar return, and you can set the threshold for that. This is a threshold for some of your ACM, automatic lock-on modes. There's some controls up here for your pulse Doppler filter thresholds. You don't really have to play with those much. If you ask a real-world aircrew, they probably kept those in the default positions 99.9% of the time. You can fool around with in ground mapping. You can play around with the pulse gain and the pulse video. I'll show a little bit of that when we do ground mapping. Brightness is obviously brightness. Erase. You can have the paint sweep be a little bit more vibrant and the erase sweep be a little less, erase a little bit less by playing with the erase control here. The IR adjustments here aren't really applicable. These didn't really have a function in the real world either. Back in the early days of the F-14, there were plans for an IR tracking system that was never really implemented. And so in the real world, these IR displays and this IR push tile to put it in its IR display mode never really had a function. So you can ignore those. Radar is obviously your radar display. IFF here puts up an IFF display. I'll show you that here in a little bit. This is your transmitter channel and your missile channel. Transmitter channel is your radar channel. The missile channel is for the Sparrows and Phoenix. A little bit on how that works. A Sparrow, being a semi-active radar homing missile, it tracks a separate beam of RF that comes from the radar. It's called continuous wave illumination. The radar transmitter, the AUG-9, is really two transmitters in one. It's got two devices in it called traveling wave tubes. It's got a tweet and a G-tweet. The tweet's a traveling wave tube and the G-tweet's a gridded traveling wave tube. I can't remember which is which, but one of those generates the RF for the transmitter, and the other one generates the RF for the continuous wave illumination. And that's what the Sparrow, that's the beam the Sparrow is normally riding when you launch a Sparrow, is the continuous wave illumination. It comes out a separate little antenna. If I remember right, it's the, I'll put a little picture in here. It's the, and when you look at the antenna, a dish, there's a little separate waveguide down at the bottom. It's got like an orange piece of plastic over it. But that's your continuous wave illumination antenna. And when you launch a Sparrow, that continuous wave of RF energy just comes out that waveguide, and it's very directional because you want the Sparrow tracking the target that you're single target tracking, right? And nothing else. And so that's it rides that relatively narrow beam of continuous wave, RF wave emanating from that antenna. And this chooses the channel for that continuous wave illumination, and that kind of plays into that on the CI. If you remember, I showed you that missile options switch with it's got normal and SPPD to launch a Sparrow in pulse Doppler mode. So kind of when you would use that switch is their OG9 has bit sequences. One of those bit sequences is sequence 3, and it tests the transmitter functions. And well, if that bit sequence 3 showed you that the continuous wave illumination had failed, there's a couple things that'll kick off that failure in that bit sequence. If the continuous wave amplifier is less than a certain amount of power, it'll fail that test. If the flood antenna switch failed, it'll fail that test. So the flood antenna. So normally when you launch a Sparrow, it's riding that beam of continuous wave illumination off the OG9 radar because it's directional, and that's what you want. But if you lose that single target track, what it'll do is it'll switch on the flood antenna. The flood antenna is a antenna. It's a flush mounted. It's right in front of the windscreen, and it'll put that continuous wave illumination out of that antenna, and kind of a narrow little cone. But that's kind of plan B, right? That Sparrow is going to head for whatever is reflecting that energy, which is why you want that narrow beam from that little antenna on the OG9 antenna. And that's why you use a directional antenna like that. You don't want the Sparrow picking up, side lobes or anything like that and heading off onto something you don't want it heading off onto. But if you lose a single target track, it switches to that flood antenna. It gives you a chance to kind of save your shot there by attempting to keep that target within the conical pattern of that flood antenna. That's kind of how that works. But if bit sequence 3 showed you that your continuous wave illumination had failed sequence 3, then what you'll do is switch your missile options for your Sparrow into SPPD, and then the Sparrow will guide off of your transmitter channel instead of that continuous wave illumination. Again, it's not what you really are after because you don't want it heading off on something that's picking up off of one of your radar side lobes, but it's better than nothing. So so that's what these thumb wheels are for. What else? I think that's a little bit of what I wanted to cover here. All these switches here. This switch, if you have an extremely high closure rate, you can flip this, and it changes the scale of your range rate scale here into a ×4 display. The other thing is that aspect. It kind of sets some parameters in the Doppler filter bank. If a target is heading away from you or towards you, you can flip the aspect switch here and try and improve your pulse Doppler sensitivity there. It's kind of what that is for. So yeah, I think that is most of what I wanted to cover about what you're seeing on the DDD. So let's go back live here and look at some other stuff. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll run a intercept on our data link hostile out there. We're just inside 200 nautical miles. I'm picking them up in range while search. So let's go ahead and we'll challenge IFF. There's my friendly and close there, and there's my non-friendly out there. I'll go ahead and deselect the data link symbology, and we'll see if we're getting them in track while scan. Looks like, yeah. So now what I'll do is I'll designate this guy here as a friend. I'll designate this guy out here as a hostile. and we'll keep pressing. He's on a magnetic course of 120, so he's going to pass from my right to left here, and I'll let him do that, and we'll just keep pressing on him. All right, he's about 5 degrees offset now at 60 nautical miles. He's on a course of say 120, 117 actually. So what I'll do is I'll get Iceman up there to put us on about 10 degrees right.
Copy.
And since he's doing that, I want to keep this guy in my scan. So I'll slew over here. I mean, we're going to watch that closure. So we're on a parallel track right now. You can see this velocity vector straight down. So we're basically paralleling them. It gets to about 30 miles or so, we'll go ahead and lock them up. So we'll lock them up. And I'm actually going to put them in a pulse STT, because if we're going to turn in on them, we're going to lose a lot of closure. And I don't want to lose the lock. So what I'll do now is I'll hop up front, let Jester take over back there. I want to keep him offset a little bit. We don't almost want to charge right at him. We want some turning room when we arrive. Remember that from our intercept geometry lesson there. Go ahead and put my steering T, center up my steering T. Lost it on the hood, I don't know why. It's on the VDI.
Target, 19 miles.
There she is. So with the steering T, now what you want to do is just center it up. You want the steering T in your aircraft reticle. And when you're doing that, you're steering where the AUG-9 wants you to. Which with a missile selected is in lead pursuit.
Target, 14 miles. It's game time.
Oh, Jester, I'm sure they're friendly.
Target, 8 miles.
And to the old stern conversion, I'm going to go ahead and put them on the TV here. Oh, it's a Russian bear. All right, so we looked at using the radar against some friends. So let's take a look at using it against some enemies here. We got some MiG-29 spikes ahead. So I'll go ahead and I'll get set up. I'll turn master arm on. Go to air-to-air mode. Go to TID repeat on my TID. And I'll go ahead and turn my roll SAS off, which is also on the Tomcat's combat checklist. And I'll go ahead and select Sparrow, and then I'll go ahead and hop in the back seat here, take over for Jester. So we got a couple contacts out in front. One right on the nose. It looks like one over here. Data link is painting it as well. I can tell by the symbol on the bottom. I can interrogate them with IFF, and I'm getting good IFF return on the nose there. That's a friendly guy. Getting two good IFF returns. All right, so we got some friendlies out there. Let's go ahead and extend the range out a little bit, and Data link is sending us some hostiles way out in front there at 40,000 feet. So we'll go ahead and press on those guys. Carrying a 2-2-2 load on the Tomcat here. That was one of our common loads that we used to carry. 222 is what we call a medium range patrol sort of loadout. The other common one we would carry would be four Sparrows, four Sidewinders. That's more of a ACM type loadout. We would call this one a medium range patrol type loadout. But that's what I'm carrying here in this mission. So we'll go ahead and continue pressing on. I'll go ahead and go to range while search, which is one of my longer range detection modes here. Let this picture build. Range while search should pick these guys up when they're approaching 100 miles or so. So right now it looks like, oh, we just started picking them up. Got two contacts on the DDD. This one closer in is probably the one here with a lower closure rate. The one it's picking up out here, I can tell by the velocity vector here, got some serious closure with this guy. This is the guy out here that's closing on me at about 1,000 knots. Looks like now we're picking up the other guy. He's closing a little slower. The one thing you got to kind of get used to is not directly correlating what you're seeing on the TID with what you're seeing on the DDD. Remember, the DDD is in range rate, right? So the guy on the left is farther away, but up here he's closer because, or it appears to be closer because I have a lower amount of closure on him. Maybe he's, well, I can see he's not coming as directly at me as the guy on the right. Maybe he's zooming or diving, but that's what you're seeing on the DDD is azimuth versus range rate. So gonna let these guys continue to close. I'm gonna let them get in a little bit closer before I switch to track while scan. Track while scan does not have the range of range while search, so I don't want to lose him when I go to track while scan. And I'm not going to take a shot until he's fairly close. This is a 1v2 here. I want a good high probability shot when I do take it. So let's go ahead and switch to track while scan. Pick these guys up. So what you're seeing now, I'm getting rid of the data link. So what you're seeing now, let me pause it real quick. You're seeing the launch zone display, although it's kind of hard to tell, but I'll throw a graphic up. So what the launch zone display is, this line represents the time to R-min of the Phoenix. When it first started, if I went to track while scan real far out and was picking these guys up, the line would be a lot longer, and there would be a dot at the end and then a brighter section kind of in the middle. The dot at the end represents R max of my selected missile. So when that line shortened to the dot, that would be when I was at R max, and then it continued to shorten, and it got to the bright area there, and that represents the optimum launch range. Continued to shorten past that as it has here when you see these, and it will continue to shorten down, and when it disappears, you're at R-min. So that's what this symbol here is the launch zone display that you're seeing. The other thing you're seeing is the OG9 determined launch order. So the one on the right here is who is going to launch on first, and the two over here is who is going to launch on second. And again, I want a nice high probability shot here, so I'm not going to take a shot until these guys are at 50 miles at least, and maybe I'll even push it farther than that. But so that's what you're seeing here on display, and we'll let it continue. I'm going to hook this guy. He's at Angels 33. He's 38 miles. I'll take my shot. All right, so now what you're seeing, I'll pause it again. This is a time to impact timer for that Phoenix on the right-hand side. So that's what you're seeing there. So now I'll go ahead and hook the second guy here. What's he at? 45 miles. I'll go ahead and launch on him. All right, so now we'll go ahead and I'll switch to the front seat here and monitor my flight.
Spike, 12 o'clock, dead ahead.
Yeah, so guy at the head is launched. Lost the launch indication. I'll keep pressing. I see some contrails out there.
Okay, we're on.
Get a little closer. Who we got out there? We got a guy going high. Let me pause it real quick. So what I'm going to do now that I'm in the sort of the visual environment here, I'll be raising my ACM guard and I'll be using my dogfight mode. Pilot automatic lock on is a dogfight mode. I'll be using. That's kind of akin to wide acquisition in the Hornet. It does like a 10-degree 8-bar scan and locks up to the first thing it sees. So I'll be using that. And while I got it here in pause, the flags on the ACM panel. So what those are is my missile status. Any missile that's loaded and ready on the airplane is going to have a white flag. For a radar missile, the white flag indicates that the missile has tuned to the AWG-9's frequency as well. And then a checkerboard means that station is selected. So when I select a missile, the station that the AWG-9 is going to shoot next will be a checkerboard. So that's what's going to happen next here. Hot trigger, master caution. I don't have time to deal with that. Oh, I turned my roll SAS off. That's the master caution. So let me go to PAL here. Lock this. I'll go this guy going high here first. Let me take a launch on him. See what happens. I don't see the other guy right now.
Target, 12 miles.
Maybe the Phoenix took care of it. Let's see. Let's press on this guy. You see a contrail over there on the right. I'm not sure what that is.
That's a MiG-29.
Thank you. Go to TV. Yep, sure is. Come on, Mr. Sparrow, do your job. All right.
Break right. Oh, got him, splash.
Got him. Let me defeat this guy here, hopefully. All right. He's going down. Who else do I got out here?
Going down.
I don't see anybody else out here. Oh, I got somebody over there. See if Powell will pick anybody up. I don't see anybody. Am I clean? No, I'm not clean. Oh, it's got somebody. Oh, there he is.
Spike, 12 o'clock.
Let's see if that Sparrow will take care of him. Sidewinder ready.
Target, 8 miles.
So neither Phoenix got anybody, but at least it looks like I got him running. So gave me a fighting chance here. All right, Sparrow took care of that guy. All right, so that's kind of how an engagement will go in the Tomcat. So there you go. All right, so now let's take a little look at operating the LANTIRN pod. When you have the LANTIRN loaded, you'll have this LANTIRN joystick in your cockpit. To use the LANTIRN, you put the TID into TV mode, and then you press P to bring up your lantern display. Let's first go over the joystick. Let me go ahead and pause my headset here. Alright, so the main controls you're going to be dealing with on your joystick. On the left, what this hat does, now this joystick doesn't move, it is actually fixed. So you don't actually use the joystick like a joystick, you use these hats on it. So this hat over here, this castle switch, it does 4 things. If you push it forward, it puts the lantern into point track mode, and it will lock onto a point on the ground and track it. If you put it down or back, it's an area track mode. And the lantern, this seeker will ground stabilize, but you can move it around. It's not going to lock onto a point. Move it left and right, you slew the seeker to waypoint. To the left, it's to the previous waypoint. Slew it to the right, it's to the current waypoint. I believe that's how that works. So this is for left and right is for slewing the seeker to waypoints that it will inherit from the mission editor. And what you got chosen as your destination steer point there, and then backwards and forwards is point track and area track. This is your slew hat for slowing the seeker head. Now I should mention that a lot of these are going to want to map to your joystick naturally. Most people don't have a second joystick to use, but a lot of your joystick functions you probably want map for AUG9. So what I do is I put a modifier. I have a home cockpit here with some toggle switches, and so what I did is I mapped one of my toggle switches as a modifier. So when that toggle switch is flipped, my various mappings on my joystick are for the the lantern, and when it's not flipped, my various mappings on my joystick are doing AUG9 stuff. So that's one way to do it. Just pick something, a key or something that you'll want to use as a modifier, and use that to share your joystick between lantern and AUG9. But this one is your slew. I have this mapped to my my TDC on my throttle. Now when you press it, it switches between black hot and white hot, and I have that mapped to my my TDC to press. This over here, if you push it forward, the seeker slaves to the armament data line, to the airplane. If you push it down or aft, the seeker goes to what they call a snowplow. It's kind of forward and down. It's kind of a useful point of view. And then if you put it to the right, it slews the seeker to what you have designated. So if you designate a target and then you go wandering off looking at other stuff, you can easily get the seeker back on what you designated by slewing it to the right by this hat switch to the right. So that's a key one. This is your field of view. It cycles between 3 fields of view on the lantern, 3 magnification levels. So map that to something that's useful. The trigger on the front of it there, map that. Half action turns your laser on, and full action designates a ground target. So you'll want that mapped. The switch around the front over here, you know, is kind of like your nose wheel steering button switch up in the front. That is latched laser fire. So you press that and the laser latches on. I think it times that after a minute. That's opposed to half action on the trigger, which is just you have to hold that to keep the laser firing. So those will be key ones you want to map. Down here, arms your laser. And that is most of what you're going to need to know on the lantern. So you map those things and you'll be in good shape. All right, so here we are in the back seat, zoomed in on the TID here. This is my own aircraft data block up here. I'm in white hot. This is my gimbal information here. Right now I'm in air-to-air mode. Let me get myself in air-to-ground mode. Right now the sensor is cued forward to the armament data line. It says armament data line in air-to-air. It says HUD in air-to-ground, but it's basically straight ahead. This is my laser code. What you're seeing here is a masking signature. This is basically if I let the pilot lets the reticle get outside of this boundary here, it's going to be masked by the airplane. I'll be looking at the airplane and not the ground. You see, it's kind of, if you can imagine the airplane, this is the body of the airplane here. So that's what we're looking at. This is that cued snow plow position here for the seeker. I got a waypoint out there. I can go ahead and cue it to waypoint. I got some trucks out there. You can see it's cued to waypoint 1. I can put it in area track mode, and as you can see, it's ground stabilized. The airplane is moving, but my reticle will not. I can zoom in up here. There's my trucks I got out there. It gets kind of pixelated as you zoom in, but so there you go. Over here is my target block, lat long, elevation, distance, heading, time to go. So as we fly into here, let me go ahead and arm my laser. The L there shows you that the laser is armed. If I go to half action on my trigger, you can see it'll fire my laser. And as we get closer, it'll be able to point track on these guys. We're too far away right now. It's not able to lock up to them, but as we get a little closer, it'll be able to point track. Let me get my bomb selected over here so we get the proper bomb symbology. I got some GBU-12s on board. I want to release one of them. I'm going to put the pilot in manual bombing. Remember, his steering cues are going to be on the LANTIRN display, and in the front seat on the VDI, he's seeing this LANTIRN display. So I got him in manual bombing. Since we're not using the airplane to bomb with, we're using the LANTIRN. So continue to try and get up here on these trucks. Let's see if I can't get a point track. There's my point track. So now I can go to half action and then full action, and now it's designated it. And this is the pilot's steering cues up here. His job is basically to keep this line lined up with this caret. That's his job. And then as he gets closer, there will be a bomb fall cue or a release cue. March down this line, and when it hits those captain's bars, it's time to drop. So from the back seat here, we'll watch what happens. I'm obviously not going to drop a bomb in this pass since I'm in the back seat, but we'll go ahead and see the cue. Well, actually, let me jump up front and see if I can't release this up front. Look at my headset here. Well, let's see if Jester is going to keep this target here for me. So steer to the left. There you go. I'm trying to keep that in there. It's pretty sensitive as you get close. But I want to trim myself up here. Haven't had an opportunity to trim before this. But I'm steering there. Left 1 GBU is probably good enough here. 1 degree. Got to go left 2 degrees. I'm watching for that release cue. All right, time to release. Oh crap, I gotta fire the laser. Fire the laser, get back in front here. All right, time to release. Let's see if this isn't gonna work or not. All right, there it goes. Let's see what happens. See if I was close enough. 30 seconds impact. Well, it doesn't matter where I steer now, does it? Let's see what happens. Boom, there goes the truck. All right, so there we go. So a little bit on the Lantern. It's really a pretty easy targeting pod to use. I actually like it better than the Lightning pod from the A10, but that's a little bit on the basics of Lantern pod usage. All right, so I said I'd talk about ground mapping a little bit, so let's take a look at that. So what I'll do is I'll go into pulse search. I'll go into a 200-mile range here initially, and then what I'll do is I'll, if you watch the antenna elevation over here, I'll scroll it down a little bit, and I'm also going to turn my erase way down. I'll turn my video up a little bit, and we'll start painting the ground out there. So we're picking up, you know, the shoreline out there. We're heading towards the mountains there in the Caucasus. As you can see, we're starting to paint the ground somewhat. And as I said, you know, just fiddle with the elevation. You want the erase way down so it maintains, you know, the picture through, you know, its sweeps. And as we get closer, it'll probably come even a little bit clearer. All right, so there's ground mapping. Now what I'll do is I'll turn to the fleet here, and I'll show you, you know, the real good way to use ground mapping. All right, so now we're pointed back towards the fleet. Let me get back into pulse search. Fiddle with my elevation a little bit here. All right, so there. All right, so as you can see, facing out over the water, looking for ships here, you can see that ships on the water stick out like a sore thumb to pulse radar. Let me lower my elevation bars here a little bit. All right, so there you go. So there's the fleet out there. Let me reduce the number of bars a little bit more. Lower my scan here. Fiddle with my elevation a little bit. All right, so there you go. There's a nice bright picture of the fleet. So if my job was, say, to pinpoint the location of this fleet here, I can go to surface target. Where am I? DAC data. Come here, go to my DDD cursor. Hook the fleet, radar fix enable, and there's a surface target. And now if I can come to TID here, I can hook that surface target lat long, and there's the lat long of the fleet. So that's one thing that Pulse is really good for, is picking out ships on the water. So. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about navigating in the Tomcat. It's pretty simple in the Tomcat, mainly because it's pretty basic. So down the pilot's display control panel, we have our 5 main display modes, and these determine what symbology you're going to see on the HUD. You'll see pertinent, and the VDI. You'll see pertinent symbology to that particular mode. And it's pretty sparse. Now, you guys that are used to flying the Hornet, you're going to have to get used to looking down again, because there's a pretty limited amount of symbology that's displayed on the HUD in the Tomcat. But what we're going to focus on for now is our steering modes down here. These 5 subcategories here select what steering mode those displays are going to be in. So first off, we have TACAN. I think we're all pretty used to using the TACAN. I'll put in the TACAN frequency for the boat here. I'm going to make sure I have pilot selected on my TACAN command panel, that I have control of the TACAN RT, and then so here's your TACAN steering to the boat, and you can change the course that you want to fly to the boat with the course knob. So that's your TACAN steering. I think most of the folks are used to that. Next, we'll get into destination steering. So destination steering will point you to the destination that the RIO has selected in the back seat. So let's go ahead and hop into the back seat. So here we have the destination selection in the rear seat. It's on the right hand side of the TID, and the window here, you'll notice, displays to you like we saw before. It displays to you what steering mode the pilot is currently in. I selected destination steering up there. It shows destination steering back here. On the right, we have a repeater for the HSD to see what the pilot is looking at in the front seat. So one thing to keep in mind with the Tomcat is that it stores a fairly limited number of waypoints. If I go to my tactical data category here on my computer address panel, we can see the waypoints that I can define. Waypoint 1, 2, and 3, fixed point, IP, home base, we usually make that the boat or our home airfield, defended point, hostile area, and surface target. So that's what I can define. And what I can choose for the pilot is even a little bit less than that. I can choose waypoints 1, 2, and 3, fixed point, IP, surface target, home base, and then manual. Manual will steer the target to, steer the pilot to defended point. So that's what I can steer the pilot to. So one thing to keep in mind on in the sim is that the mission editor, you can define any number of waypoints that you want, but when you get in the plane, you're only going to have 3 loaded in the jet. If you look at your knee board, it'll show you all of the other waypoints you've defined. They're lat and long on your dynamic knee board. So they'll be there for your reference, but they're not going to be in your system. In your system's only going to be waypoints 1, 2, and 3. So what you can do is just kind of keep in mind, make a note to yourself, hey, waypoint 4, when I get in the jet, I'm going to define that as my IP. Waypoint 5, I'm going to define that as a surface target. That kind of thing. So that's kind of how you're going to do your waypoints in the Tomcat. So let's just go through if I want to define a new waypoint here in the Tomcat. So let me go ahead and freeze my headset here in a useful location. So I've got waypoints 1 and 2 defined up here. Let's say I want to define a waypoint 3. So what I do is I come to my cap and I select waypoint 3 here, and I just go to my knee board or what have you, and I just enter my lat and long. So I've got one here, latitude north 42300, enter. Longitude east 41104, enter. You can see it drew it up there for me. If there's a pertinent altitude for that waypoint, I can enter the altitude, let's say 20,000 feet, enter. So there you have it. There's my waypoint 3. It's defined for me. I can go ahead and hook it, get range and bearing for it. I can steer the pilot to it by selecting waypoint 3 on my destination selector here. Now the pilot's being steered to waypoint 3. So that's kind of how you do that. Same thing with all the other ones. So I want to find a fixed point or an IP. I sort of do it that same way. Now you can also do it by hooking a point on the computer address panel. So if I select IP on the cap and I hook a point on the TID, it'll go ahead and define that as the IP for me. If I select it, You can see that's my IP. It's lit that message button up there on the computer address panel. I can also move waypoints on the TID. If I want to move that, I can hook it with my HCU, select a new spot, go to full action, and it moves it for me. Now the TID is not a moving map. You know, that's not going to be too useful for you, but it could be that maybe you see a plane somewhere and you want to mark that location where that plane is at that particular time. You can just go ahead and put a hook on the TID near that and mark that as one of your waypoints, surface points on the TID. So something like that. So that's kind of how you enter and manage your waypoints on the AUG9. So now we're back in the front seat, and let's talk about positioning ourselves relative to a waypoint. You know, the AUG9 is a bit, not the AUG9, but the Tomcat is a bit old school in that regard. Unlike the Hornet, I can't just draw a course line to any waypoint that I want. So you can see the course knob is not functional in destination steering mode. So you kind of got to go old school. Any of you guys that ever flown an ADF approach in the real world or whatnot, you kind of use that method. It's called what they call it, push the head and drag the tail, right? So let's say that I'm heading towards my waypoint 1 here, and I want to fly inbound on the 120 bearing to waypoint 1. So what I've got to do is I got to kind of steer myself that way using the old school, right? So I'm going to push the head of my course here over to 120. So I'm going to fly 040 or so, and then go ahead and make my inbound heading to this waypoint 120. So here I'm flying 040. Stay there for a bit. You can see my needle is starting to inch its way over there to 120. As it's getting close, I'll go ahead and get on course. I've got the autopilot on. This is your basic autopilot mode. It's called pilot assist. Basically, the autopilot kind of makes the airplane rigid, and it'll kind of stay where you put it. It's kind of a useful mode. That's what I'm using right now. That's why the airplane's acting this way. So there we have. We pushed the needle over to 120, and now I'm flying an inbound bearing of 120 to my waypoint. Once I get inside of 5 miles or so, I kind of stop chasing it, and I'll just put my heading on 120. I'll let the needle do what it's going to do until I get 5 miles on the other side. And then once I get 5 miles on the other side, then you're playing drag the tail to stay on an outbound radial. So now that we're about 5 miles out, now I'll drag the tail. If I'm to the right of 120 outbound, I'll go ahead and drag the tail over to the left and then get back on 120. So when you're heading away from the waypoint, you're playing drag the tail. So that's a little bit about basic navigation in the Tomcat. All right, well, I think we've covered everything I wanted to cover, and I think we know enough now to be dangerous in the back seat, literally. So It's time to head home. Iceman, take us home. It's time for some sliders and bug juice.
You got it.